to vote. It was not until 1938 that the first working class Britons were entitled to paid holiday. And it was not until 1967 that two men or two women were allowed to express their love for each other without breaking the law. And it wasn't until 7 years ago that they were allowed to marry. This evolution of these rights is the great story of the 20th and 21st century. People stood up to demand that they would be treated with fairness, dignity, and equality. All of us are dependent on legal rights to live our lives freely. This is at the root of what it means to live in a democracy. It's about empowering everyone in society, not only those who happen to vote for the winning party once every 4 years or so when we have the vote. And that is why individual rights are protected by the Human Rights Act. And that is why the government and other public bodies are perceived to have broken the law, or when they perceive to have broken the law, the public is able to challenge them through judicial review. And let us not forget how difficult it was to win these rights in the first place. It took the tyranny and the bloodshed of 2 world wars in half of a century until European leaders came together to learn the lessons of a fascist dictatorship that was popularly elected. The European Convention on Human Rights, which resulted, laid the hidden foundations that help us live together freely and fairly to this day. From the right to express an opinion, to the right to fair pay, access to education, a decent place to live, privacy at home, and protection from abuse. I'm proud that it was a Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who signed the Human Rights Convention in 1950. Just as I'm proud that it was another Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who created the Human Rights Act in 1998, which finally incorporated those rights into domestic law. But this does not have to be partisan. Let me be clear about that. It was a former Conservative Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who was one of the first world leaders to set out his vision for a charter of human rights guarded by freedom and sustained by law. And another Conservative politician, David Maxwell Fyfe, who drafted them as the beacon of those at the moment in totalitarian darkness. Labour and the Conservatives have disagreed on so much in recent decades, but until the arrival of this current Prime Minister, mainstream politicians in both parties have supported human rights, and both parties have recognised the importance of judicial review for the public to be able to challenge the government when it breaks the law. Sadly, Boris Johnson wants to divide us by putting our shared rights and freedoms under threat. In this Parliament, Boris Johnson has announced the government's plan to dilute and attack and water down both human rights and judicial review. Last September, Number 10 gave briefings to the Sunday Telegraph that they're planning opt-outs from the Human Rights Act. They threaten Britain's place, they say, in the European Convention on Human Rights. All countries in Europe, both those who are in and outside of the EU, are members of the European Convention of Human Rights, except one, Belarus, which is an authoritarian state. The Prime Minister's lapdog, Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland, whose job it is to defend the role of the judiciary within government, even attacked the rule of law itself, accusing it of being left vulnerable to politically motivated interests. Alongside this, the government is stripping the public of its right to protest with the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill. It is disenfranchising millions of voters with the Voter ID Bill. The senior Conservative MP, David Davis, summed this up best earlier this week when he described it as an illogical and illiberal solution to a non-existent problem. And through threatening the UK's obligations to the Good Friday Agreement, the government has isolated globally our international standing, show disdain for the rule of law and how it travels across borders. This is the first British government in my lifetime which appears determined to swim against the current of human progress, as well as to roll back our rights and the rule of law. Rather than uniting Britons around the common values we share, he's intent on waging a grubby culture war designed to stir up division. While it was right for the government to curtail our freedoms as a response to the pandemic, it is totally wrong to use this emergency as an opportunity to undermine the framework of human rights we desperately need to keep. Make no mistake, Boris Johnson is cribbing notes straight out of Donald Trump's playbook. In doing so, he's allying himself to the world's populist nationalists, from Viktor Orban in Hungary to Narendra Modi in India. We would be naive to take our rights for granted at this moment. They are under threat. Labour's response to Boris Johnson's culture wars must be to refuse to take part. Instead, we will focus on strengthening the common values, interests, and rights we all share. The attack on our rights comes at a time when the justice system has never been more vulnerable. 11 years of Conservative cuts to the justice system, the closure of 295 courts in England and Wales since 2010, pushed it towards the brink of collapse even before the pandemic began. The government has been forced to apologise for rape convictions and prosecutions falling to a record low. And the backlog in the Crown Court stands at an all-time record high at almost 60,000 cases. Victims of violent and sexual crimes are being told to wait for years to get their day in court, leading many to drop out entirely. The government has ignored Labour's proposals to strengthen victims' rights and protect women and girls from violence. But this does not deter Labour from its mission to make sure victims come first in the justice system. To do this, we need to strengthen, not water down, human rights. The Human Rights Act is not enough to protect all of our rights on its own, but it does provide the foundations that help us live together freely and fairly. We need to ensure that the Act is applied correctly as society changes. The Act is essentially a contract that protects the individual from abuses by the state and which enshrines certain positive individual rights. But it is this contract between the state and the individual where there is still some ambiguity. Only some service providers are ruled by the courts to be pure or hybrid public bodies, and only those which have public authority status are bound by the Human Rights Act. We live in an era of privatized public services, crony contracts, and conservative sleaze. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where unusual contracting out arrangements were used, Labour will consult to ensure that the scope of public authority status is as broad as is necessary to defend the public's rights. On top of the Human Rights Act, we can build further rights and protections based on the same values. And that is why today I'm setting out Labour's commitment to go further than the current Human Rights Act in domestic law. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is an international human rights treaty which sets out the rights every child has: life, survival, and development, protection from violence, abuse, or neglect, an education that enables children to fulfill their potential, be raised by or have relationships with their parents, express their opinions, and to be listened to. The UK ratified the UNCRC in 1991, but it has not been made part of our domestic law. This means that many of the protections contained within it are not accessible to children and young people across the UK. We have to do better. The government's disastrous handling of schools through the pandemic shows us what happens when children are treated as an afterthought. So many children have been denied the right to education by this government's incompetence. By the end of the 2020 school year, the government had distributed just 213,000 laptops and tablets. This left 1.5 million children without a laptop, tablet, or desktop. They needed to access teaching remotely, forcing them to miss up to 75 days of education between March and July last year. Labour's Children's Recovery Plan includes an education recovery premium to provide additional funding for schools to provide extra academic catch-up to children who have been left behind. But there have to be the means that children have to access the rights that the government owes them. So just as Labour brought the 1950 commitment to human rights into domestic law in 1958, in government, Labour would legislate to bring the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law too. This is more than we can explore. There is more, sorry, that we can explore that goes beyond children's rights. The UK has signed up to a number of international treaties which say that everyone living in the UK is entitled to the right to health, the right to social security, the right to adequate housing, and the right to other socio-economic rights. But unlike other countries, the UK has done very little to incorporate these rights into domestic law. Following the catastrophes of Grenfell and Windrush and the scandal of fire and rehire, it is clear this gap can stop people from accessing the rights to which they are entitled. The Welsh Labour government is already doing groundbreaking work in this area by determining which socio and economic rights could be integrated into domestic law. We too should explore what other changes could be made to make the rights of our government has signed up to internationally a reality in everyday lives. I started this speech by talking about my ancestors. Their struggle to be recognised as of equal value to every other person was a historic one. They saw first the brutal indignity of societies that neglected individual rights in favour of mob rule. But their story of the struggle to be recognised is not unique. And it is not only those who are facing the evil of chains who depend on human rights. Human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that we exercise and enjoy every single day. Human rights are the essential tools that empower us to stand up to people in power. Human rights are the integral part of Labour's mission to make the UK the fairest country in the world. Any politician who attacks them attacks all of us. Labour will strengthen your rights because Labour will stand up for you. Thank you very much.
A huge thank you, David, for that speech. We have now our respondents, and we'll start with Gracie Bradley. So over to you, Gracie.
Thank you very much, and thank you, David. As I say, I'm joining you from Liberty, which is one of the oldest human rights organisations in the UK. And we were founded in 1934, and our vision then was the same as it is now. It's to stand up to power. And if you are at all alarmed about the all-out assault on our democratic freedoms that seems to have come to a head this week, then please do consider joining us. And as Karis and David have already mentioned, this has been a really significant week in Parliament for very regressive legislation. We have seen the Policing, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill pass its scrutiny in the House of Commons. And that's a bill that aims not only to silence us when we protest in the streets, but also to decimate the way of life of nomadic Gypsy, Roma and traveller people, and to magnify the over-policing of working class and racialised youth through more stop and search and a prevent style duty for knife crime. We've also seen what has rightly been dubbed the anti-refugee bill introduced to Parliament, which aims to criminalise seeking safety, as well as criminalising saving lives at sea. And we're also expecting we have the electoral integrity bill, which will only serve to silence people at the ballot box when, of course, efforts are already underway to do so in the streets and in the courts. We know, as David has already mentioned, that there are further threats to come to the laws and legal processes that help us all stand up to power. We're expecting a potential judicial review bill. And of course, as has been discussed, there are some really worrying proposals to water down our Human Rights Act. And our Human Rights Act is incredibly important. It's a law that was passed with cross-party support, and it brings our convention rights home. It makes them accessible to all of us in our everyday lives. It protects the rights of people in care homes, in detention centres, it protects journalistic freedoms, it supports people whose loved ones have died. And I know that there is a cross-party chorus of support to defend it. We also know that judicial review is a really vital legal tool. Everybody makes mistakes, and public authorities are absolutely no exception to that. And judicial review is really important for all of us in being able to challenge public authorities when they get it wrong. So as I say, this has been a really significant week of regressive legislation in Parliament, and this is coming to a head just as government has spent a lot of time press conferencing Freedom Day. And, you know, Liberty has long argued that actually policing and criminal punishment should never have been the primary response to a public health crisis. And so while we would welcome the removal of fines and criminal sanctions, it's really disappointing that we continue to see a failure to support people materially to stay safe and to recognise that safety and freedom are in fact collective endeavours. But it doesn't have to be this way. And I am, you know, I'm an experienced activist and organiser, and I am never one to promote the fiction that the only place that we win equality and justice is in Parliament and in the courts. But at the same time, now more than ever, we need our elected representatives to step up, and we need to see a coalition that reaches across party lines. Yes, that includes and is championed by the opposition, but also by government backbenchers and beyond. We need to see a whole chorus of voices speaking up to defend those principles that would keep us all safe and free. And so it's really encouraging to hear what you've said this evening, David. It can all sound like doom and gloom, but there are in fact lots of progressive policy proposals out there that are really encouraging. You know, we've seen the Liberal Democrats talk about repealing suspicion of stop and search. We've seen the Green Party talking about full workplace rights for migrants. And so, David, I'm really heartened to hear that Labour will work to strengthen common values and better protect children's rights and explore how we can strengthen that very strong foundation that is our Human Rights Act. And, you know, this has been a year where it's been illegal at times to sit on a park bench. It may yet become illegal to go to a noisy protest. It may yet become illegal to save lives at sea or to seek safety from persecution. And I think that this is really bringing into very stark relief something that justice organizer in the US, Marianne McCarver, tells us, which is that not all harms are criminalized and not everything that is criminalized is harmful. And I think it's really important that we take this moment to think in the most expansive possible terms about what justice means. Because if we look at authoritarian law and order responses to events like 9/11 or the 2011 riots, we see that in extraordinary rendition, in torture, in the Prevent programme, in civil orders, in the gangs matrix, that some approaches to justice can become injustices in themselves. So, as I say, it's really encouraging to hear that Labour will stand up for human rights. And I know that there are colleagues across the House in every single political party who will be glad to do so with you. And it's really important to diagnose how we got here. Because I think that that's partially through remaining solely in defensive mode. And so it's really encouraging for us all to collectively begin to think about how we might build on that excellent foundation that is our Human Rights Act. That's a key priority and that's absolutely necessary. And I would make one final invitation to policymakers, whatever party they might be in, one that extends beyond legal rights. And it's really an invitation to think about a vision of justice and rights that does more than campaign against what we don't want, or that aims purely to punish people once harm has happened. I would be really excited and interested to work with people towards a justice that involves people in and resources communities to transform the conditions of alienation, deprivation, exclusion, and trauma that are the cause of so many social harms today. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gracie. And I love that phrase, safety and freedom are collective endeavours. That feels like one for our times. We'll turn now to Professor Kate Williams, who is on the line.
unmute myself. Hello all, and thank you, David, for that fascinating and inspiring speech. It was so important to hear it. And, you know, I was just thinking, oh, sorry. There we are. There I am. Hello all, and thank you, David, for that inspiring and fascinating speech. And thank you, Gracie, for those really inspiring words as well. So important, and so important to think about at the moment. Because just as you were saying, David, I mean, it feels like our rights are particularly under threat at the moment. We see, if we look back in history, when we have moments of national crisis, for many of us, they are a case of just trying to get through the crisis. But at the same time, we see sometimes governments using them as an excuse to create, to roll back our rights, with the excuse of it being crisis. You know, it's a crisis, so we have to roll back our rights. And people let this through because we accept we're in crisis mentality, and also people are distracted, they have other matters to think about. So I think that even though people might say, why are we talking about human rights when thousands of people are dying? Human rights are so important because if we don't preserve them now, they can be rolled back at any moment. We think of the very regressive, very oppressive rights, sort of laws that were brought in as part of the World War I crisis. We can see a similar thing happening now in COVID. And I was thinking of what you were saying, you know, how you were talking so brilliantly about history, about Windrush. And I think what's so striking, isn't it, about our perceptions of ourselves as in Britain is that we perceive ourselves as a just and fair country, but so much of the truth of history shows something that's very different. And I was thinking about, there's a statue, I don't know if any of the viewers have seen it, there's a statue of Queen Victoria in Derby Square in Liverpool, which has a lot of statues, and there's a statue of Queen Victoria, and she looks like she's a goddess in a temple, and she's surrounded, this was put up 1906, just after her death, so, you know, really embodying the height of empire, the Victoria as the ruler of a quarter of the world's population, and around her are the winged figures representing peace, justice, and charity. And I think we see so many images of justice across this country, but our legal system is one that consistently, we have an image of ourselves as just, but we have an image, the reality is that you say the legal system is consistently underfunded. Many, as you said, court closures, courts are being closed, there's massive backlogs, and we have a situation in which things are against the law, but the law doesn't seem to be able to prosecute them. So just as you've been talking about so brilliantly today, and also so much in Parliament, that sexual assault and rape is against the law, but so why is it that we cannot prosecute it? Why is it that we have this pitiful level of convictions that we cannot prosecute it? That the law says one thing, and yet what happens in our actual reality is not the same. So we have and I was really thinking about that in terms of obviously Windrush, you know, when both the experiences of those who arrived in the Windrush generation, in which, you know, prejudice and inequality was illegal, but at the same time they were consistently prejudiced against, and that we have the current Windrush situation in which compensation has been agreed. It has been agreed that everyone, it was wrong and people should be compensated, and yet here we are when so few people have been compensated, and very few people have suffered for all the depredations that they experienced. And I was particularly, so I think, you know, what you were saying, it was, you know, incredibly heartening to hear what you're saying about the justice system, that our justice system is horrifically underfunded, and there's this huge backlog, and, you know, people within it, working within it, cannot always give the service that they want to give. And we have a situation in which many of the conviction rates and many of our what laws are enacted simply isn't working either. And then on top of this, we have, as you were saying, human rights being eroded by a government who is using the crisis excuse to erode back human rights, to say we can't protest, because using these COVID rights, and obviously most recently about medical records being simply handed over and could be used for any kind of commercial use, human rights being eroded. So, and it's so important to hear what you're saying, and particularly about the culture war. So this is something, of course, that, you know, there's a bit of a culture war about history set up every week. The culture war that Johnson is dragging the country into to distract from the more punitive things that the government are doing, that the culture, and they distract everyone with arguing about statues, which are important and should be discussed. But, you know, when Johnson was talking about protecting the Churchill statue, that statues are for historians, statues of the communities where they are, to decide whether or not they still want them up again. They're not the Prime Minister's job. So the culture war in which he's kind of dragging us into to distract from what's really going on. So I think, as you say, you know, justice has to underpin our future. A just system has to underpin, a just legal system has to underpin, where if you do commit a crime, if a crime is committed against you, you should be expected to have fair treatment across the board, so that those who commit crimes should be treated fairly, and those who are victims of crime should be treated fairly, because, you know, victim support has been so very much cut down, and there's many of those who have victims of crime suffer so greatly as well. So that we should have a justice system in the future that can be fair to all who experience it, and a justice system, I think, above all, that is not being used as the tool of the elites, that is not being used as a tool of the wealthy to perpetuate privilege and perpetuate oppression, because that's what it was used so frequently for in the 18th and 19th century and parts of the 20th century. And what we need in the 21st century is for the justice system to be one that is not the tool of the most powerful we have here. So it's incredibly heartening to hear of what you're saying and what you do in Parliament and all your work. And let's hope for a justice system that is fair, and for a government that is not playing, as you said, to the populist playbook. Thank you.
Huge thanks, Kate, for those remarks. So we're going to turn now to questions, and I know that there are lots of questions already for me in the Q&A function, but please do add more, and we'll get through as many as we can in the time. I want to start by abusing my position as chair, though, and asking you a question, David, which is about the culture war. And, you know, people in the Conservative Party might say that they're not trying to inflame a culture war. They are trying to speak to concerns that voters have. In your view, why is if there is a culture war, which I think you do believe, why is it succeeding? What does that say about how people feel, and how would Labour seek to address those deep-seated feelings?
Well, look, let me give you some examples of why there definitely is a culture war. And why leadership is so important in these moments. And that means that if you're Home Secretary or if you're the Prime Minister, you tread lightly and gently, always thinking and understanding that the key component of a civilized democracy is how you treat minorities. So, for example, the Black community in this country is 4% of the population. I know it can feel larger than that in London, but it's 4% of the population. It's a tiny, tiny community. When American athletes decided to get down on their knee during the national anthem in a football game, what they were doing was praying. They were showing the ultimate act of respect, but praying for a better future for African Americans and for Black people globally. It's therefore a travesty and a disgrace that we can have a Home Secretary who thinks it's okay to boo English players in solidarity with that movement across the world. Let's pick another minority. It's tinier than the minority that I'm part of. Let's take the minority group hugely overrepresented in our criminal justice system over centuries, the community of Gypsy, Roma and Traveller. The police say the current laws we have are good enough. Yet this government puts into a bill last minute a decision to challenge those people in their nomadic way of life, knowing that it cuts to the heart of who they are. And so that's the culture war. And you put minorities into the frying pan in that way. Totally, totally unacceptable. And in the end, what those of us who are progressive have to do is, of course, we've got to call that out for what it is, which is shameless division. but actually attend to the big issues. The big issues in justice are not playing around with judicial review. The big issues are the courts, the backlog that we've got, victims suffering. Those are the big issues. And you can see that right across. Look, we've got Gavin Williamson deciding to bring forward a bill about freedom of speech on university campuses, where we've got thousands of children left behind. That's the big issue. So it seems to me that there is a way to go for progressive parties to understand, you know, the case you've got to make to the public, but you've got to call out the division for what it is. And it's pure, nasty, old style politics that really should be on the hard right and not in the mainstream, coming into the mainstream.
And of course, you mentioned footballers taking the knee. There has been much discussion about the English football team and the values that they're espousing and putting forward. Does that make you hopeful for how
it does? I mean, I think clearly our sense of civic patriotism, where all of us are included, all of us, whatever the colour of our skin, whatever our backgrounds, I hope is something that is sustained beyond just football and the English team playing football. But I do think that Gareth Southgate's letter to the team at the beginning of the campaign and the way in which that fantastically multi-ethnic team is demonstrating their Englishness is a tribute to us all.
And we wish them luck this evening, of course. So I'm going to turn now to audience questions, and I'll ask the IPPR team just to put those up for me. Thank you. And we'll start with one from Daniel. And he asked, additional legal requirements placed in organisations or people are labelled by some right-wing figures as unnecessary red tape and are sometimes blamed for the loss of jobs or drops in productivity performance. How do you respond to those sorts of arguments? And how will you ensure that additional rights-based legislation is not derailed?
I mean, look, let's be clear. There's a hell of a lot of red tape that suddenly people are having to get used to as a result of exiting the European Union. So I do think that those arguments about rights effectively being red tape quickly running into the sand when we've got much of the cultural sector now tied up in rings if they want to tour or go abroad. You know, when we've got the huge problems that we're seeing that were of course predicted in terms of the border in Northern Ireland. No, look, I do think, and it's why I've said today that we will be looking, like we've seen in Wales, at social and economic rights, social rights and economic rights, which have not been adopted and incorporated here in our country. We've got to do better to make those rights live for people. And there is an argument that when it's about your housing, when it's about your education, when it's something really tangible to you, as well as the traditional rights around freedom of expression and liberty and other things, it starts to cut through in society in a particular and a different way. And I think the time has come, as we're seeing in Wales, and indeed actually in Scotland, for those of us here in England to think harder about those rights. And it was really seeing the travesty and the treatment of those that died in Grenfell Tower and Windrush, and then the education piece over the course of the summer that took me to a place where I realised that the time has come to look harder at this.
And we heard from our respondents that COVID has changed the political environment in terms of what is being brought in terms of restrictions on protests and so on. How do you see that? You've talked about the education piece. There's also that piece of, you know, the COVID restrictions enabling government to bring in these very restrictive pieces of legislation. Do you see that continuing? Can it be a temporary thing?
look, I think those laws should always have been a short-term measure. I was very worried when I looked at some of the figures in relation to who was being fined, and even during effectively a lockdown, the huge disproportionality in terms of the figures and the amount of ethnic minorities that found themselves caught up in those numbers. I think the public have grown weary of rules that are determined for them, but don't exist for senior members of government. I'm afraid you and I cannot be engaged in hugging even under the current laws, let alone what Matt Hancock was up to in his office with his special advisor. But let's be clear, I'm not being scurrilous now in terms of the video, but but I am saying not one jot of legal action, when for the public it's something else entirely. That's unfair. That feels like as Kate was indicating, a legal system predicated on the elite getting away with it and ordinary people struggling, and actually a government that's too willing to bring in draconian laws, as both Gracie and Kate were saying, under the cover, if you like, of emergency.
Mm-hmm. I'll turn now to some more questions, and we have one from Marley Morris, who is an associate director here at IPPR, actually. And I'll ask our panelists this as well. He's asked, what are your views on the Nationality and Borders Bill, in particular the provisions to create differential rights for refugees, depending on how they made their journey to the UK? And so that's a reference to the harsher measures for people arriving by sea, I believe. I don't know, Gracie, did you want to come in on that one?
I mean, I can speak to it very briefly, insofar as I'm sure lots of people will have seen Freedom from Torture commissioned a very interesting legal opinion that set out, apart from the fact that this is obviously incredibly cruel, it's also probably not lawful. And it absolutely flies in the face of all of the principles in the heart of the Refugee Convention that the UK so proudly signed decades ago. I mean, I think the reality is that this is a piece of really, really distasteful grandstanding, because you don't discourage people from coming by, essentially all this bill is going to do is make people take ever less safe routes. It does nothing, again, to transform the conditions that people are moving from. And it's very likely to kind of strengthen the hand of so-called people smugglers. But really, it's perniciously targeting, those people who say, well, I'll try and drive the boat so that everybody doesn't die. It's a really grotesque piece of legislation. And it hasn't come from nowhere. We've seen what's happened in Australia. I wonder if people have read Behrouz Bashani's account of being in an offshore detention camp in Australia, and I think it's really important that people do so. But I think one part of the bill that people may not have, that perhaps has received less attention, is that the government is also proposing to put certain kinds of legal challenge outside of the scope for migrants. So we see that it's not just, as with so many of these things, it's not just an assault on a particular community. It's again another assault on the rule of law and the legal framework that protects all of us. It's the government, again, putting itself outside of the reach of scrutiny. And yes, this time it's in the refugee bill, but we've seen the same thing in the overseas operations bill, in the CHIS bill. This is happening across the board. So those would be my headline reflections. And I think, Freedom from Torture and Refugee Action and the Refugee Council are doing some brilliant work to oppose this.
Sorry, if I can just follow up. You said that there are politicians in every party who you think would want to support human rights. How optimistic are you for that bill and the scrutiny process through Parliament?
I mean, that's a good question. I have to say, given the absolutely enormous spread of regressive legislation that's there at the minute, this bill, Liberty, we're really going to defer to some of the subject matter experts on this, and our priority will be the policing bill and so on. If we look at the bill, then we haven't seen those conservative rebels who've been so vocal about civil liberties in lockdown come out for that fundamental right to express yourself in the street, which is really disappointing. But at the same time, on vaccine passports, on the overseas operations bill, we have seen cracks in that majority, and we have seen the government concede to some really broad and unusual coalitions. So no, I'm not incredibly hopeful, but I'm not kind of completely pessimistic. And as ever, I think it's never just Parliament. It's always a confluence of pressure that comes from lots of different directions.
David, what about you? Nationality and Borders Bill?
Well, look, I think that, what starts to happen with government is they're sort of arrogant. They run away with themselves. The coalition that brings them to power shrinks. Opposition grows. And I think that we will see more of that. Will it come to the aid of the most vulnerable? I name-checked gypsies and travellers in the current bill before Parliament. Will it come to the aid of asylum seekers? I'm not sure, sadly, is the truth. But the articulation of resistance is important, because in the end there will be a different government one day, and we can repeal some of this nonsense if it goes through.
Great. Kate, did you want to come in on that question?
Well, I agree with what everyone's saying, and I think also it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's not about the migrants. It's not about the people who come here and make, there's been all these really fascinating research done on how much migrants give to the country when they're here, how much they give economically, how much they give culturally, and how much they work, and also for their children to go forwards. And of course, Ms. Patel is a sort of representation of that, of these, how migrants, contribute so much in economic terms, and so many in cultural, spiritual, so much enrichment to the country. And so that's not whether, I think it's very interesting what Gracie was saying. It's not about Parliament. We're stuck in this discourse that keeps repeating about migrants as taking things, EU migrants taking things, people of colour taking things. And first it was Polish who've been demonised, and now we've got people of colour being demonised. And so it's particularly terrifying, and it's obviously the bill itself is very wrong, but the whole ideology we have about not recognising what migrants bring, not just to Britain but any country that they go to, America, Australia, as you were mentioning, all kinds of countries, all kinds of countries across the world. And so I think that really, it's not easy, but changing the narrative, and we need to get away. Obviously we don't spend our lives talking about Nigel Farage when migration comes up, but so we move away from the Nigel Farage chasing after dinghies, and we're talking more in public discourse about what migrants bring to this country, and about what the overall enrichment. And I think that is a huge cultural shift, because what people have always been encouraged to do from the beginning of time by governments is to demonize their fellow men, divide and rule, divide and conquer, rather than us engaging with the question of elites. We're busily demonizing our next door neighbours, because we think we're demonizing Polish next neighbours, demonizing next door neighbours of colour, demonizing Windrush people who came in, and but I mean, I'm not saying this is easy, but I think that they're all part of the same thing, because this migrant bill is playing to a public who've been whipped up to feel that their problems, and from the NHS to schools to jobs, are not because of the decisions made by the global elite and this country's elite, but decisions made by individual people who arrive here making a better life for themselves and their children. So it's a big discourse change for us to enact. But I feel like Gracie that we can do it.
I have so many questions about how we achieve that, but I'm going to turn instead to the Q&A. So we have a question here from Ronan, and it says, the Environment Bill, which is currently before Parliament, and the government's response to the independent review of administrative law both propose limiting the remedies available for environmental review and judicial review. Does the Labour Party want more or less judicial review? Should some matters be political only, or should courts be able to exercise supervisory jurisdiction on every single matter?
Broadly, we believe that judicial review is working well. the amount of judicial review cases is actually down. Whilst the government is targeting judicial review, it's really important to remember that for lots of ordinary people who are taking out judicial review, they're taking out against a local authority, against a government agency. It's not all directed at the Prime Minister. And there is not any sense that there's a significant problem. The government asked Lord Folkes to look at this. He looked at it with a committee of people. There were lots of submissions, and broadly, none of the submissions recognised the need to do anything about it. And so what did the government do? It ignored the consultation and started a completely new exercise. So when asked what would Labour do, we do not see judicial review as anything that requires legislation. There isn't a politicalisation of our lawyers, of our judiciary. They attempt to stay very well clear of politics and simply to interpret the law. And broadly speaking, I think they do a good job at that. Though it's the government politicising them, and it's dangerous when you do that. It's possible to do that because by definition, our judges are slightly mute in the public sphere. They have to be. They have to stay quite very, very neutral. They're not publicly out there. And so it's easy to caricature them and potentially to demonize them. And it's worrying that there are elements of the current government that want to do that.
Activist lawyers? How do you respond to that phrase?
Well, again, I mean, it's another one of those, I want to live in a country where anyone that needs it can get a lawyer to defend them, to protect them, to advise them. And that those who are poorest in cases that merit it can also get legal support, what we call legal aid, to assist them. And to demonize lawyers that support, say, asylum seekers is just wrong. It's just wrong and totally unacceptable. The same government, by the way, that denied the Windrush victims access to lawyers and tried to do the same, actually, to the Grenfell families.
We'll take another question, and we have several coming up here. We have one from Eulalie. The genesis of taking a knee that David describes implies that there is not a culture war, that the culture war, including that way of describing public protests about statues, which is the public engaging in debate about how it's space, the public space is used, is in essence a nativist fantasy. I wonder whether we should even be acquiescing into this description.
I think Eulalie makes a very fair point. It's a tactic. And what is the tactic? The tactic is you coin a new phrase, or you take a phrase that the public hardly know and you turn it into something else. I want to give an example of this. The phrase woke. The phrase woke derived a few years ago in African American communities, which was simply a way of saying to a friend of yours, are you woke? Are you awake? Are you conscious to the plight of African Americans and why we are in this position? Enslavement, Jim Crow, affirmative action, that context. That's what it was. We've seen this right-wing attack turned a phrase in a community into basically, it's the same narrative that was used about political correctness. It's a way of demonizing something that most of the general public were not aware of and turning it into something else in order to throw in all sorts of things, basically to say these progressive liberals want their rights and your rights denied, or your history denied. The debate about statues is similar. The public are allowed to engage in a debate about statues. Personally, I don't want statues to people who've committed genocide against my ancestors lauded up. I'm not saying the history should be got rid of. I think it's more appropriate for those statues to be in museums where they can probably properly described and properly debated as a relic of the past. That's the best place for statues like that, not on public display as a sort of as iconography that we celebrate. The era of enslavement is long gone. Why would we laud that today? That is the debate the public is engaged in. To describe that as a culture war is really to say that they are attacking a majority culture. That is so pernicious, because the majority culture today clearly states that enslavement and slavery yesterday was an abhorrent thing that we turn away from. That is the majority culture. It is not the culture of people who say, why have we got that as an icon? So we do have to challenge this and push back.
We'll take the next question. And we still have some more coming in. Please do keep upvoting them ones that you'd like answered for our remaining time. I've got one from David. It says, I agree with everything David said, but how does Labour make the case for human rights without getting mired in the Tory-inspired culture war? And how can Labour make the argument relevant to those people who voted Conservative in so-called federal seats? Is making the case for social rights the answer, or does that fall into another Tory trap? Welfare is for scroungers, not hardworking people. There must be a good way to make the argument that is positive, not offensive.
Look, I think that the question is a legitimate question about comms and communication. I think there have been challenges for progressive left, centre-left parties globally in how we communicate to the public, particularly a public tired, weary, and on the wrong end of globalization, particularly. Or where industry and jobs are left behind, where the kids have got to travel down to London for work. Look, I think it's clear that our opponents have been better at language. But I sort of indicated that you have to be clear at where you stand. So I don't think, for example, that the Labour experiment of putting control immigration on mugs was a great thing to do, and I said so at the time. But actually, in the end, what the Tories are up to with this culture war will empirically not work, because in the end, it is what's happening in our schools, what's happening in our hospitals, what's happening on the streets in terms of crime that the public really care about. And so the question is, when the government say they're going to level up, will they actually deliver for the people of Hartlepool? And how will the people of Hartlepool feel in 2 or 3 years' time? Will they see those services that they rely on improved? I suspect not. And Labour has to be in that place, ultimately, communicating successfully. That's a bigger debate about what language you use and what is the communication. But I do think you have to call out the divisive tactics for what they are. And actually, I would say that what's been really interesting, say with Priti Patel saying it's okay to boo the vast majority of English people do not think it's an okay good thing to boo your team. That totally backfired, totally. So you call it out for what it is at the time.
Okay, I wonder if you want to give us a bit of a kind of historical perspective on that. How have these things played out in the past? Is this something that we've seen in the past, or is there something different and new about this time?
As in the culture war in the past?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you are absolutely right. And I think this is one of the key questions we're asking in the kind of public intellectual sphere of, do we counter the constant culture wars, the constant attacking of the National Trust and putting up a small plaque about slavery and all the rest of it that pops up every weekend? Are we fueling it by engaging with this, or are we countering it? And of course, I think we're all choosing to counter it, but it does mean that the government is setting the agenda, and the agenda they're setting is one of culture wars. And yes, exactly, there have been ways, these creation of culture wars right from the beginning. And I think statues is particularly fascinating because 20 years, I mean, we campaigned against roads when I was at university, but no one paid any attention to us whatsoever. And now, of course, with Colston, it became much more important. And simply what fascinated me after Colston was everyone saying, and a lot of them saying on social media, well, I think Colston was a bad guy and we shouldn't have a statue to him, but we should have brought it down by democratic means. And the problem was that the people of Bristol and many influential people in Bristol had tried to not bring it down, but put a plaque on it by democratic means that simply said that Colston was a slave trader, not a good man. And that was impossible. So we have a situation in this country, I think, when there's a huge amount of entrenched fascination with a nostalgic version of Britain, which is one of the empire and one of white supremacy and one of Britain ruling the waves. And when people say, but a statue of 1895 commemorating a slave trader isn't appropriate in the 21st century, we began this kind of outsurge of panic about it. And just as David was saying, the sportsmen who choose to take the knee, why does this become so significant? Why is this such an obsession with the government trying to distract us? And certainly in historical terms, governments throughout history have tried to distract people from looking at the basic question of what rights do we have, what human rights do we have, and what is being taken from us, and what compensation do we get for our back-breaking labour. That governments throughout history have tried to distract us onto other matters, and often it's been pro-government propaganda. White supremacy during the 19th. White supremacy was used very effectively during the 19th century to try and stop working class people for campaigning for their rights within Britain. So you have this, the Tory government is using. I'm old enough to remember the single mothers being demonised. So there was a complete obsession with single mothers. Do we remember that in the John Major government? I think there was a brilliant spitting image sketch of like, what's responsible for like world wars, famines, and it's like single mothers. It was all single mothers. So there's different group, and if someone tried that now, everyone would say, why? This is pointless. But we have this fascination with demonized groups, and the Conservative Party are using it, just as David is saying, a kind of sort of gripping the effective way, and we need to dissipate this, and dissipate this. And the simple fact is that people who go to the National Trust houses won't mind if there's a plaque about slavery. It really won't bother them. Why this has to be front page news of every of the huge coverage on this? No one will mind. There are all kinds of historical plaques up in National Trust houses, and everyone will find it interesting and useful and important context. So I think that that we have to keep fighting against the cultural war, and it sometimes is rather energy sapping, but certainly it's one that's been consistently used by governments, particularly on the right in the past, but notably on the right, and it is a very effective way, just as I was saying, of divide and rule in the population.
Thanks, Kate. So we'll turn now to, we've probably got time for one or possibly two more questions if we can squeeze it in. Got one from Path. A few months ago, Robert Buckland said courts are the servants of Parliament. Do you agree or disagree, David? And did Labour believe in an alternative interpretation of parliamentary sovereignty?
No, I mean, look, we have a system where Parliament has legislated, courts interpret that legislation and create precedent. And to that extent, courts, of course, are the servant of Parliament. But we also have a system where if Parliament hasn't legislated, courts derive and work out, discern where the law is in a particular point, again, using precedent. That is the system of common law that we have. It's a system that means that globally, people come to this country often to fight claims, particularly commercial claims, because our legal system is one that's hugely respected, and we throw it away at our peril. There is no threat from judges in this country. Absolutely none. It's just not on the agenda. If there's an agenda in terms of our judiciary, the agenda is about diversifying our judiciary and making sure that we have many more women in our judiciary and many more ethnic minorities that represent. That's an agenda that we can all get behind. It is not an agenda about arguing that judges are acting as politicians. They are not.
So we've probably got time for one more. I think some of these we've actually possibly touched on already. If you could just go to the top row. Let's go with David's, and that's: can or should the case for human rights be woven into a wider narrative about economic and social security? And is that the way to get out of the culture war trap?
Possibly. I do think that you miss a trick on the whole for populations if your right to housing, your right to education is diminished and no one seems to care. And those are obviously broad rights that affect hundreds of thousands of people. So I think that the movement that we're seeing in Wales and indeed in Scotland is for a reason. And it's why I'm signalling that Labour in England needs to look hard at those economic and social rights and other countries that have incorporated them, and as a consequence have the breadth of that canon that came out of that movement after the Second World War. We don't have that full breadth, and I think it needs to be broader.
Fantastic. We're running out of time. I do want to ask you, David, if you've got any closing remarks, because we've covered a huge amount there. Are there any kind of things that you want to add or expand on?
I think I want to remind people that we are only a year since, we're a year or so on from the general election, and we're some way to the next general election. And so I suppose in parliamentary terms, there's a lot more to come. There's a lot more to come, and obviously Labour is hugely weakened by the majority that we have, and the Lords to some extent scrutinises, of course, but it has to tread carefully because of its constitutional arrangements. So it really is important that civil society, whether it's think tanks, Liberty, or a community of historians, are fully engaged, active, vigilant, persuading, arguing, speaking to local people, not completely centered in London, by the way, all over the country, are having these debates and these discussions, because we've got a few more years of this to come.
And there's a lot to lose as well as to gain. Well, a huge thank you to David and to our speakers, Gracie and Kate, for really illuminating comments and words from each of you. Please do keep following IPPR. We've got research that touches on some of the things that we've talked about today, including on the protection of rights and the rule of law. In the coming weeks, we're starting a new project on migrants' access to justice in partnership with Praxis, the Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit. And we're also continuing our work on the implications of the UK-EU trade agreement for the safeguarding of workers' rights post-Brexit. So do please sign up to our newsletter and follow our channels if you'd like to hear more about those. But for now, a huge thank you to our speakers, a huge thank you to everyone who's asked questions and the audience, and enjoy the game.